Another big Portland company accused of polluting the air is settling a lawsuit with neighbors who say they were exposed to toxic chemicals.
I can't believe that a company like that would let it go on for so long and keep contaminating, because we had no idea.
And researchers say the evidence is actually in the moss nearby.
I did know that there was high nickel in moss from that area because it showed up in our data set.
And speaking of lawsuits, an Oregon City teenager is suing her high school after she says they outed her as a victim of abuse during an assembly.
The video shows a blurred out student confessing his assaults on his girlfriend, his ex-girlfriend.
Plus, it's been 8 years since a tragedy in Oso, Washington, the deadliest landslide in U.S. history.
We didn't see or hear any signs of life out there today.
Here's the story.
I'm Pat Doris. Welcome to The Story. All the ways to communicate with us right there at the bottom of your screen. You can email us. The address is thestory@kgw.com. You can use the hashtag TheStoryKGW on Twitter or leave us a good old-fashioned voicemail. Just call our number, 503-226-5090. We're going to start out tonight by talking about air quality. Each of us has the right to breathe clean air that's not contaminated with dangerous chemicals. I mean, it seems so obvious to say that it's almost silly. But not everyone gets to breathe clean air. Some people live by factories that pollute. But thanks to the Forest Service researchers based right here in Portland, moss, that's right, moss is now pointing out trouble spots, and its use is spreading nationwide. Before we get to the latest, let's jump back in time to explain how we got here with a story I did 6 years ago when I first met Portland's premier moss researcher.
We see lots of moss, lichens. There's lichens growing with the moss. They're really similar. You see
Trees and the things that grow on them
this moss
have enchanted Sarah Jovan for decades.
It's got a base with little holdfasts that help anchor it
They
to the
told her
tree,
stories
and then
about the
you
health
get
of
the tree
forests,
20 minutes.
and now the health of cities.
You'll see a lot of this around
Along the way,
also.
she picked her favorites. She loves lichen and until recently hated moss.
I always looked at moss as lichen bullies because they compete for space, so I've always been a little biased against moss, but I'm a fangirl now. Pour a little water in.
She discovered moss held an amazing storehouse of pollutants,
It just absorbs the water really quickly.
absorbing and
Basically,
saving,
it has
ready
these
to
green
reveal
skin,
where
it
heavy
collects all
metals
kinds of
lurk in the
dirt.
air.
The moss is like, hey guys, over here. Stop scraping me off your roof.
Jovan and her research partner, Jeffrey Donovan, collected 246 moss samples around Portland. Their goal, to document how trees clean the
I'm
air.
gonna just get a big handful.
Analyzing for metals
There it
was
is.
an afterthought.
That's it.
When they ran the computations and generated the maps, the heavy metals leaped to the surface and stunned
Grubby,
even
this
the
moss is.
researchers.
Yep. The first time that we looked at the data in a map form, we're like, there's a bullseye over bullseye. And I had to double check. I'm like, is that the name of the facility?
It is indeed. Months later, air monitors confirmed high levels of cadmium, which causes cancer and kidney problems, spewing from the Bullseye Glass Company.
It was right
It
there.
was right there. And then, of course, you're like, oh my gosh, there's schools there, there's residential areas. It was actually really frightening.
It would be months before public health agencies and the Department of Environmental Quality alerted the public.
But I'd like to
What
know
followed
whether
were
DEQ
angry
or-
public meetings, the firing of a top air quality official, and a class action lawsuit. It was the first time such research techniques were used in a U.S. city, making Jovan and Donovan celebrities in their field. She's not used to the spotlight,
Yeah.
but she's glad to have played a role in pioneering such a cheap and effective method for sampling air pollution in America.
There you go.
And by the way,
Yeah.
and her opinion of moss has changed forever.
I'm so proud of the moss. I know, and to think that I just grudgingly accepted that I had to work with this grubby moss, and now I'm like, orthotricum, thank you.
She's a lot of fun. Since that story, by the way, the neighbors of Bullseye Glass filed a class action lawsuit. The company settled in 2019 for $6.5 million. The moss research was also used in a second class action lawsuit, this one against Precision Cast Parts in Southeast Portland. The company settled earlier this month for $22.5 million. That money includes millions of dollars already spent at the plant on better emission controls. Neighbors living within this area around the metals parts manufacturing facility are eligible to file for some of the settlement money, but you have to do it by April 9th. Hopefully you can see that on the map there. Now let's catch up with Sarah Jovan, the Forest Service moss expert. I got to talk with her today at Kelly Point Park. Her most recent big project was in the spring of 2020 when she went to the Seattle area to help train the Duwamish Valley Youth Corps. That's a group that wanted to collect moss in the Duwamish Valley. They found arsenic and chromium levels in moss in some areas that were double the amount found here in Portland in our polluted neighborhoods.
It's the first time any group of people, like non-scientists, has really done the method and done a good job. We had experts also go out and collect moss just to compare and make sure, and they did fantastically. Their data were repeatable, and yeah, it was great. New way to do it.
Sarah spent much of the pandemic compiling results of her research, writing it up for a scientific journal. She's also fielding requests for similar help from other parts of the country as more and more people get the idea to study moss, looking for warning signs of heavy metal contamination. She feels good about that most recent work in the Seattle area where people in poorer neighborhoods were getting sick but had little information to help explain it.
So that was very rewarding to me to be helping solve this long-standing problem. So there's one air quality monitor, maybe two, in that entire area. And so you can imagine if you want to learn about neighborhood scale pollution, that doesn't tell you anything. So yeah, they now are armed with a whole bunch of very specific information about where the metals are, and that helps focus those follow-up efforts. And hopefully, therefore, at the end of the day, they'll reach solutions that are more helpful.
We're all lucky to have the Moss Lady. By the way, the Bullseye saga continues. The Oregon Health Authority is holding a virtual community meeting April 5th at 6 p.m. where you can comment on OHA's health assessment draft report for Bullseye Glass. A link to the hearing is on our website right now, kgw.com. Now to a much different kind of lawsuit. A student at Oregon City High School is suing the district over allegations they essentially outed her as a victim of abuse at the hands of her boyfriend. It happened during an assembly intended to spotlight mental health and share students' stories last month. Alma McCarty has a look at the case.
Students marched out of Oregon City High School in protest of what they called a disturbing video. This walkout days after it aired during a virtual assembly in early February. No justice, no peace! Parents, equally distressed by the clip, took complaints to the school board.
The video shows a blurred out student confessing his assaults on his girlfriend, his ex-girlfriend.
That ex-girlfriend, referred to as 18-year-old Jane Doe in these court documents, is now suing the school district. The senior demanding more than $832,000 for intentional infliction of emotional distress and invasion of privacy. The lawsuit alleges OCHS held a school-wide assembly February 2nd, which featured a male student, John Doe, videoed in silhouette, but without masking or altering his voice, confessing abuse and assault against his former girlfriend. The suit goes on to read, students immediately recognized the person in the video, and by extension, recognized the plaintiff. Jane Doe alleges the district acted negligently and with reckless disregard by broadcasting the video to more than 2,000 students and staff without her input or consent. The lawsuit also alleges that students sponsoring the assembly warned school administrators not to include it, but school staff overrode those objections. The lawsuit comes after the district already received a formal complaint. Last month, the interim superintendent confirmed an investigation into the assembly and video was underway.
They failed our kids.
Backlash against the district continues as several parents last week voiced demands at the latest school board meeting for more action and accountability.
The lack of transparency has made it seem that nothing is being done and no one is being held accountable for their lack of judgment. You talk about protecting people's identity, but that wasn't even for a thought for the kids that were aired in these videos.
KGW reached out to the district seeking a response to the allegations in the lawsuit, but has not yet received a response.
Alma McCarty joins us now, and you've covered this for a little bit now. I have to assume that the school was trying to do the right thing, right? Get mental health challenges out on the table, let kids know they're not alone. But in the aftermath, kind of looks like it fell flat.
Certainly did. I think that they had the best intentions with this assembly, and many in the district who were part of the school board, for example, they seemed very apologetic that this ever happened. And they did have what they said, like safe rooms and counselors after this assembly had aired, because they realized just how devastating this one video submission was. I was told that it was a series of 3 different videos that were submitted by students. They were meant to be anonymous, just little clips about how they were dealing with mental health over this last couple of years that have been pretty tough for all of us. But the last video submission was the one that bothered a lot of people, a lot of parents, a lot of students, and they brought their concerns forward, obviously with the student walkout, and then parents brought their issues and their thoughts to the school board.
And it seems obvious to us now, but in any high school, friends are going to recognize that student's voice, and of course they'll know who the girlfriend is. And then also I'm thinking that this is why physical abuse survivors, sex abuse survivors think twice before they let their story out, because they're worried about losing control of it.
Losing control of it, and I think maybe the perception in this lawsuit. She talks about her reputation potentially being damaged. She talks about how these abuse incidents she wanted to keep private. This wasn't something that she ever wanted to be broadcast to the school. We obviously don't know the extent of any of this, but to kind of lose control in that way, I just cannot imagine the grief and just the trauma really that she went through. And it was clear that a lot of other students were behind her in that regard. That's part of the reason that they walked out, because they too were horrified by hearing this broadcast to the class just one morning in school. And you know, the lawsuit filed in hopes that this wouldn't happen to anyone else.
All right, Alma McCarty, thank you very much for the update. Oregon is a divided state with big cities and small towns and people in each who sometimes just do not get each other. It's one of the challenges waiting for the next governor in Oregon. There are 5 Republicans who have campaigns and cash that we think make them viable candidates. So many that we didn't have time to hear from all of them last night. So tonight, we're bringing you the other 2, Dr. Bud Pierce and Christine Drazen. We're going to ask them the same question. Let's hear from Drazen first. She's the former minority leader in Oregon's House of Representatives. When I asked how she would unite the state or the legislature, she talked about the legislature.
The opportunity for accountability and balance in Salem, you're not going to get there unless you actually have someone from the opposing party to invite them to work a little harder to negotiate, to work a little bit harder to bring into that conversation more people that might otherwise be left out of that solution. Right now, some of the top-down solutions really leave out entire sections of our state or intentionally go out of their way to harm them in support of something else. It's kind of winners and losers. As Oregon's next governor, I would treat people in the other side of the aisle with respect, and also demand some accountability for some of those policies and processes, and welcome the opportunity to sit down and arrive at some compromise that serve more people.
Bud Pierce is a cancer doctor in Salem. When I asked him the same question, he thought of places outside the legislature.
I think the main problem with the deep red areas is we've taken away their economics, because most of those areas are natural resource based and timber based and such, and they used to be incredibly prosperous. If you look at their per capita income, it was like leading in the state, and we took that away from them in our environmentalism, really. And I think that the only way to bring them together, bring urban and rural together, is to make the rural successful again. And people say, well, they just have to. You can't, we have federal laws and such. Well, I would say if you said the Silicon Valley or the, Silicon Forest in Oregon, that we'll give you 10 years, you're shutting down, we'll give you money, and you need to find something to replace what you're doing, they couldn't do it. And that's really what we said to timber and natural resources and such.
Bud Pierce thinks Oregon should reverse some of those policies in rural Oregon. By the way, we've posted a lot of these interviews in full length on our YouTube page. We've had to edit down some of these comments because we don't want you to be here for 5 hours. Well, we would like that, but we don't think you'd like that. Tomorrow night, we'll put that same question to the 2 leading Democrats who want to be Oregon's next governor.
Are you enjoying being mask-free in Oregon and Washington? COVID cases are still dropping here, but they're spiking in parts of Europe. So how worried should we be about this new variant?
It's not clear-cut what the impact is going to be.
when the story continues.
Welcome back. Keep sending your questions and comments to the story at kgw.com or give us a call. Leave a voicemail at 503-226-5090. And while I'm thinking of it, we'd like to hear some of your questions for the National Librarian Convention. Do you know that starts tomorrow in Portland? Something like 3,300 librarians are going to be here. So what would you always want to have asked a librarian? Here's your chance. Send us your email or leave a voicemail. We'll try and get down there and ask those librarians those tough questions. Some about Dewey Decimal or maybe the paper stock they're using these days. Very interesting people. I love librarians. All right, let's get to this email we got from Mario. He wrote, a few weeks ago, you guys talked about a new subvariant of Omicron that I've not heard anything more about. The news is saying the subvariant is way more contagious and deadly. Can this be verified? Here's what we know. The new subvariant is called BA2. Health experts say it is 50 to 60% more contagious than the initial Omicron variant. But, and this is key, they say it does not appear to be more severe or more deadly. Thank heavens. It's also causing a surge of cases in some parts of Europe right now. So, I bet you want to know, will it cause a surge here in the Pacific Northwest? We wanted to know that too. We asked Dr. Peter Graven at OHSU about that. He's been modeling the COVID forecast for Oregon since the beginning of the pandemic.
It's not clear cut what the impact is going to be. We've seen several countries where BA2 has become the most dominant strain, and it hasn't generated a surge that amounts to much. We've seen some other places where it looks like it is correlated with a surge. However, there's also other factors that might be at play. The biggest thing is that BA2 is really similar to the existing Omicron in terms of severity, which is significantly less severe than Delta. And so that's the good news. It's also quite likely that previous infection should give you some immunity. So I think because Oregon's had, unfortunately, a ton of infection over the last 3 months, if you haven't noticed, that actually does provide some immunity. So we'll see how much progress BA2 can make. It may become dominant, but may not generate a surge. I don't think it's capable of really generating anywhere near the surge we just experienced.
And he has been spot on, so we're going to trust him. Researchers at the University of Washington agree, by the way, with Peter Graven. Their new models show the cases will continue to decline for the entire country. Their projections go until July, and you can see that nice, flat, low line on that graph. Well, today marks 8 years since the deadliest landslide in U.S. history. It hit the small town of Oso, Washington. 43 people were killed and almost 50 homes destroyed. We went into the KGW vault to take a look at our coverage from the day after that tragedy happened.
Today, a closer look at what the flow of mud, trees, rocks, and debris has done to the tiny town of Oso, Washington, and what responders are up against. At first light, by air and on foot, the search continued for victims.
We didn't see or hear any signs of life out there today, so that, of course, that's very disappointing to all the emergency responders that are here on the scene.
But the search efforts will continue.
It is still an active rescue mode, search and rescue mode. It has not gone to a recovery effort at this time.
These pictures from the Washington Department of Transportation show just how big the area of the slide is. You can see from the upper left-hand corner where a huge piece of the hillside spilled into the valley and into the Stillaquamish River. A closer look shows just how deep the slide is.
So the slide came from the north of the road here, across the development, across the street, and into this valley of trees.
The pooling created fears of a catastrophic flood event. Today, the river found a way around the debris.
And what you're seeing it happen is it's draining off here, going back underneath, back to the riverbed.
Authorities believe the slide was caused by groundwater saturation from recent heavy rainfall. State Route 530 is blocked for a 1-mile stretch. No word when this 2-lane road will reopen.
And today, friends and families of those who died 8 years ago returned to the slide site to remember their loved ones. A permanent memorial is finally on track to be built thanks to those in the Oso community who've worked to make it happen. Groundbreaking is expected to happen in the fall, and the memorial will take about 2 years to complete. Also in Washington, the state is sending a new statue to the other Washington to honor a Native American activist.
Billy Frank Jr. liked to say, I wasn't a policy guy, I was a getting arrested guy.
We'll look back at his legacy when the story continues. A Native American icon will soon represent the state of Washington in Washington, D.C. Billy Frank Jr., who fought for fishing rights against the U.S. government, will have a statue made in his memory on display at the U.S. Capitol. It will replace a statue of pioneer Marcus Whitman. Those behind the move say they're not trying to erase anyone's history. They just think it's time to honor someone else. Here's Drew Mickelson.
Billy Frank Jr. liked to say, I wasn't a policy guy, I was a getting arrested guy.
How many people can say getting arrested helped them earn the Presidential Medal of Freedom? For decades, Billy Frank Jr. was repeatedly arrested for fishing under rights that were supposed to be guaranteed by treaties with the U.S. government. Nearly 50 years after the courts sided with Frank Jr., his legacy will live on.
This comes off an old tree. It was down. It fell.
Fellow Nisqually tribal member Hanford McLeod selected some of the cedar he would like incorporated in a statue to honor Frank Jr.
Because talking about the statue for the mold for the statue of Uncle Billy would be an old growth cedar tree that he spent his life protecting because it's sacred to our people.
In the 1950s, with then Vice President Richard Nixon on hand, the state chose to honor pioneer and missionary Marcus Whitman with one of the state's two statues in the U.S. Capitol's Statuary Hall. But lawmakers last year decided it was time for a change and established a committee to design a new statue for Billy Frank Jr.
We know of Billy's extraordinary leadership, and then the question is, how do we capture that spirit and share it with the rest of Americans?
Well, I mean, anybody who spent some time with my father knows, just his presence, it was that Billy magic.
Willie Frank III is the chair of the design committee for his father's statue.
Just thinking about it gets me emotional, though, of whenever we get to D.C. and unveil that statue. It's going to be a proud day for all Washingtonians and indigenous people all over the world.
Billy Frank Jr. died in 2014. Those who remember him say he likely would not have wanted the statue, but they say what it will represent is exactly what Billy Frank Jr. was about.
That statue, that monument, that figure, that presence is going to encourage the next generation about salmon, about natural resources, and how important that is.
That was Drew Mickelson reporting. Washington's other statue in D.C. is Mother Joseph, credited with building hospitals across the Northwest. She's not going anywhere. The statue of Marcus Whitman will eventually move from D.C. to eastern Washington. Oregon also has two statues in D.C. John McLaughlin, a fur trader who had a general store at the end of the Oregon Trail, and Jason Lee, a Protestant missionary who settled the city of Salem. In 2014, Oregon considered replacing one of the statues with Tom McCall on the short list of potentials, but that didn't really go anywhere. So the McLaughlin and Lee statues remain in our nation's capital. Keep sending your questions and comments to thestory@kgw.com. When we come back, a way you can help fight hunger in our community. We're always trying to help somebody out, so this is a good time to remind you about this week's Hey Help campaign. We're asking you to donate to the KGW Great Food Drive. Good news, we've reached our goal. So far, we've provided 1.25 million meals. So we're raising the goal to 1.5 million meals. Here's how you can make a difference. Just aim the camera on your phone at the QR code on the screen and you can donate. To see all the ways you can donate, or if you need assistance yourself, you can visit kgw.com/food drive. We want to thank Pacific Office Automation, local Toyota dealers, Rivermark Community Credit Union, and Safeway for supporting this year's food drive. Hey, that's the end of our show. Thanks for watching, but remember the story, our story, that never ends. We'll see you tomorrow.
This is KGW News at 6:30.
And good evening.